Movement direction. The direction of applied movement is a key determinant of exercise effect. So movements go through a rapid stretch. So the eccentric muscle action immediately before that shortening, the concentric muscle action, which is required for power output. Back in chapter 2, we discussed the mechanisms behind the stretch shortening cycle. In order to improve these movements and appropriately program strength training for power, the quickest way is to add resistance to make optimal adaptations. But however, this is also insufficient. The performance results initially to an advancement, but soon stops improving due to accommodation. Therefore, we need to have a new overload. It is impossible for athletes to generate large amounts of force in a fast movement if they cannot develop similar or even greater forces of value in slow motion. So to be strong, an athlete does not mean to be a power athlete. It is true that all elite power athletes are very strong people. On the other hand, not all strong individuals can execute movement powerfully when combining large force and high velocity. So we have to train with added resistance in the linear, nonlinear, and jump training, as well as focusing within our max strength, the rate of force development, dynamic strength, which is max velocity, and our stretch shortening cycle. The proportion of exercise for each of these sport-specific and assisted exercises should be determined individually based on the athlete's current training age and status. Moving on to hypertrophy, muscle mass. So hypertrophy is typically the primary goal for bodybuilders. Athletes don't typically use hypertrophy as a specific aim. However, it is still an important piece to increasing muscular strength, especially for some athletes such as alignment who use heavy body weight to their advantage within their sport, and therefore they may want to increase muscle mass hypertrophy. We're also known as cross-sectional area, CSA. So maximal activation of protein catabolism, which helps essentially break down of muscle proteins, which in turn stimulates the synthesis of contractile proteins during rest. So maximal during hypertrophy volume is 6 to 12 repetitions at submax effort, with short rests less than 90 seconds, give or take. Furthermore, split routines are recommended. For instance, the arms, the shoulders will be done on the same day. On another day, legs will be done. On another day, chest and back. And then there'll be a rest day. Each day is to fully exhaust those muscles being trained. However, the system's never used in perfecting the neural mechanisms of strength and enhancement, which we'll get to in a second. But note, the frequency is 1 for each training session, as they are not training the same muscle groups or movements more than once in a week. Even though there's several exercises that are being employed within a single training session itself, the idea is to activate and exhaust that muscle group as much as possible to increase blood circulation and stimulate muscle growth and emphasize muscle mass. So here we have a couple different pictures of inducing muscle hypertrophy versus muscular strength. So the intent for bodybuilders for hypertrophy is to activate and then exhaust those working muscles. Whereas strength is focusing on the neural factors, where we're trying to recruit the maximal number of motor units with optimal discharge frequency and synchronization. Firing rate, rate coding, recruitment. The intensities are very different. For bodybuilders or hypertrophy, they're looking at 6 to 12 repetitions, whereas for strength and power is 1 to 5. Rest will be very low for hypertrophy, since we are trying to exhaust those working muscles. We're going to keep the rest at lower than 90 seconds. For power and strength, it'll be higher, between 1 to 5 minutes of rest, depending on where you're in your program. The sessions are long for hypertrophy. The session rests are long. So they're days between the same muscle groups that are being activated. You're going to have a longer duration between them. So you'll have a longer rest period. Whereas rest sessions will be shorter for strength and power. Hypertrophy focuses on 3 or less for muscle groups in a single day, whereas for strength and power, focusing on total, for instance, a power clean or a snatch, or they're focusing on the anterior to posterior push-pull balance, which goes into exercise alternation within a workout, where hypertrophy is focusing on flushing, where exercises for the same muscle groups may be alternated, where they might use a barbell versus a dumbbell in comparison to strength, where it is absolutely recommended to have exercise alternation. You have that push to pull for optimal balance. Muscular endurance. So endurance is defined as the ability to bear fatigue. And so on page 162, your textbook says it well, where endurance of muscles is manifested in exercise with heavy resistance, such as the repetitive bench press, that do not require great activation of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Fatigue is caused by the functioning of elements in the neuromuscular system that are directly involved in the execution of movement. So muscular endurance is typically characterized by its volume, or until fatigue has met. So we have these absolute versus relative endurance tests that we see in sport for elite athletes. So individual differences in muscular strength are ignored, as everyone is asked to press the exact same weight. For instance, in comparison to relative strength is measured to their specific abilities. It has been well established that there are positive relationships with max strength, with a little caveat, but those who are stronger will have better ability to repeat more repetitions than those who are weaker. However, only if the weight lifted is at 75% of their maximum strength. On the other hand, relative strength appears to have a negative correlation with muscular endurance. So sport is absolute. It's not relative. We are not matched based on our strength. Our competition is our competition regardless of our strength. Therefore, when in the weight room, we should focus on absolute muscular strength and muscular endurance. A lot of the time, we must develop both strength and muscular endurance based on the abilities of our athletes. So for example, in the textbook, it provides a male gymnast performing a cross. They are required to hold this cross for 3 seconds as a requirement. If they can't hold a cross for 3 seconds during the ring exercise, then they should train for strength, not endurance. However, if there is a combination of 5 crosses where the athlete can't perform all 5, but can perform the first 4, then they should be training with the focus of muscular endurance. Circuit training for endurance. We have the frequency, intensity, volume, and rest. So what is the goal? So what is the effective and convenient way to build muscular endurance for trainees where they move quickly from one station to the next, but with very little rest in between each movement? It's typically implemented using 50 to 70% of their cardiovascular, their 1RM, and 5 to 15 repetitions per station, with a total of 15 to 30 minutes to maximize muscular endurance. Circuit training can be beneficial, but it must be implemented with appropriate exercise selection. So these are just images demonstrating absolute versus relative strength. On the left, we can assume that the goal for our football athlete will be maximal strength and power, versus our photo on the right, where they're going to be focusing on strength, not necessarily maximal strength, but strength and muscular endurance. So endurance sports, where high energy demands are met by increased oxygen consumption and augmented anaerobic and metabolism, athletic performance is limited by the central system of circulation and respiration, rather than the peripheral muscle function alone. So optimal performance for muscular endurance requires both endurance and strength within a program, even though the goal is not to enhance, again, maximal strength per se, but it is to generate force produced by those type 1 fibers that are highly oxidized, which allows the athlete to work for extended periods of time before the onset of fatigue. That's when enhancing strength of these type fibers utilize submaximal weighted loads in combination of large number of repetitions. So we still want to focus on strength where we're between the 4 to 6 repetitions, as well as 12 to 15 repetitions, in applying to our concurrent methods. This is just an example workout where strength and muscular endurance is programmed and needed for optimal endurance adaptations. First focusing on strength and afterwards on endurance, as it is less efficient to flip the order. So you'll see here in the white bar is the strength, and the gray bar is the distance, so aerobic work, as strength will be more taxing and neuromuscular. On the neuromuscular system, we want to do that first before our aerobic work. Injury prevention. So heavy resistance training increases the strength of the muscle, the tensile strength of tendons and ligaments and bone density, and it helps focus on muscle groups, movements, balance, and coordination. So one aspect that is not in sport or a very sport specific, all athletes should really focus on is the abdominal muscles and trunk extensors and stabilize so the pelvis and the trunk, which are necessary for all movements of the extremities. This is known as our core stability. So depending on the hip abductors and the hip external rotation strength that was previously mentioned, full range of motion may be needed within a program at specific times. So understanding that we must train movements that are done on the field, movements that are also strengthened outside of the normal, can prevent or potentially resist additional force and reduce the likelihood of injury. However, if those structures of the movement are not strengthened outside of the normal range of motion, the risk of injury is higher. So muscle balance is also a critical piece in training. So imbalances between lower limbs and upper limbs, so left and right, right and left, need to be addressed. If the right leg is stronger by 10% or more than the left, this dictates an imbalance. Another imbalance is between anterior to posterior muscle groups, such as the quadriceps to hamstrings. It has been suggested that hamstring strength should not be less than 60% of the quad strength. If they are, we need to refocus on strengthening of the hamstrings. When designing a program, include active recovery. So include these movements or these activities within active recovery. Abdominal work, trunk extensors, hip joint muscle work to strengthen the muscle group specific to your sport, if and when applicable. We must include movements that resist lateral displacement of the knee and ankle and correct for imbalances for each athlete. Alter level of surface. So attention to the coordination of strength exercise injuries that can happen during stretching, but also can happening during landing phases. Remember, training is typically done in a normal condition or a normal environment where we have flat and safe surfaces. However, sports is not always competed on a flat and safe environment. Surfaces are irregular. So figure 8.8 demonstrates on the left side an excessive foot inversion resulting from incorrect landing. So we want to improve the strength of the muscles to teach the athlete to activate the muscle during landing on irregular surfaces. And as it's underlined in this image, these jumps should be performed in a very gentle and manner at a very low height to improve the ability to resist foot inversion. So this supports the surfaces on the device that's met at the top of the triangle. And again, we're looking to improve the ability to resist that foot eversion on a device with supporting surfaces meeting at the bottom